So here is a challenge for you. What about this sequence? 0, 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 7, 21, 49. What's the next number?
I'm going to go 73.
No.
I'm just guessing.
Of course. And you know, any ordinary person would have no clue. This seemed like a totally vacuous here. And I tell you it's 165. Says, why on earth is it 165? This is the number of different mathematical knots with a given crossing number. Basically, it means there are no mathematical knots with one crossing or two crossing. There's one knot with three crossings. There's one knot with four crossings. There are two knots with five crossings. There are three knots with six crossings. And then it starts to take off, and really we get to a lot of different knots when we have a big number of crossings. But let's first talk about mathematical knots. And it's not maybe what you typically think is a knot. You see all kind of things that look, oh yeah, these are definitely knots, right? All kind of really beautiful knots. And of course here, my shoelaces form what ordinary people would think a knot. Now, nothing of this is a mathematical knot because it has loose ends. If it has loose ends, you can in principle untie it and you can form a different knot. And so there's nothing that you can say about these particular knots because nothing is topologically locked in. You can always undo the knot and do something differently. So the ideal, simplest possible mathematical knot may be just a rubber band. Okay? Well, indeed, mathematicians call this the unknot or the trivial knot because it's simply not very interesting. But if you take this rubber band, you say, oh, I can knot it, and you try to make some kind of a knot into it, and you stuff it through itself, and you do weird thing, and it may look very knotted. Well, it's not any different from what you started with because I can go and undo the same thing, and it's still the same simple ring. Well, are there any non-trivial mathematical knots that are not just opening up into a single loop? And yes, there are. For instance, the simplest knot is the trefoil knot. It's basically a closed loop, as you can see. In this particular projection, we can see it has three crossings. There's one crossing here, there's one crossing here, there's one crossing there. As I change this knot around, it may look quite different. And at some point, it may have more than just three crossings. But it never has fewer than three crossings. It may be quite irregular. For instance, you know, what is this thing? It certainly has a lot of crossings. But again, we're looking for the minimal number of crossings, so we try to untangle this and open it up as much as we possibly can. And if you're patient enough and do that, we can see, oh, look, three crossings. There's one crossing there, there's another crossing there, and there's another crossing down there. And nothing I can do is get fewer than three crossings. Of course, I can twist it, make a fourth crossing, bend it here, and make 6 or 7 crossings. But we're looking for the minimal number, and the minimal number in this case happens to be 3 crossings. And with 3 crossings, for a mathematician, these are the same knots. They're both the trefoil knot.
How do you know when you've reached the minimum number of crossings?
Well, you put your finger on a very sore subject because you don't. Now, for simple knots, there's no question that these are the simplest possibilities. But say you're going to 20, 30 crossings or something like that, you can't never be quite sure. And as a matter of fact, it's still an open problem to really have a very complicated Gordian knot and figure out what type of knot it is. But because of that, because once you have the simplest view of a knot in a way that's the one that has the fewest crossings, that tells you what class you're in. Now, if it happens to be 3 crossings, then there's only one possible knot, the trefoil. Actually, it's not quite true, because if you were to make a mirror image, you could not deform this into its own mirror image. But mathematicians say, okay, look, we can mirror this thing, so we're not counting that separately. Now, can we make a knot with 4 crossings? Here is such a knot. And in this particular projection, you probably just see 4 crossings. So one over here, there's one over on that side, and then there's one in here, and there's one down there. And it turns out 2 things. There's only one type of knot with 4 crossings, and contrary to the trefoil, this actually is the same as its mirror image. Okay? So I can deform this into its mirror image. As a matter of fact, let's look at that knot in a little bit more detail. Here is the classical image that you typically see in a table of knots, and that's why I guess it's called figure 8 knot, because you can see an obvious figure 8 in there. That's not the only way, and all you see is all the time 1, 2, 3, 4 crossings. So all of these are topologically the same thing. The one that I showed you before in Weyr would be shown like this in this particular diagram. So you can see these knots all look quite a bit different. Really, they're three-dimensional, and so people have made more three-dimensional rendering. So it's something that's very close to the first classical image that we showed, that simple diagram. So this is your figure 8 knot, and you can see it looks yet quite different again, but in no projection will you ever see fewer than 4 crossings. And here we are. This is the real thing. You know, solid bronze with a nice green patina done by Steve Reinmuth in Eugene, Oregon.
Can I touch it?
Absolutely. Watch out, it's heavy.
Oh, it's lovely. I love that.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Wow. Okay. That's what do we call that then? A 4.
That's a figure 8 knot, and it's a 4 crossing knot. And we have seen the trefoil knot, and we have seen the figure 8 knot. Now, if you look at the numbers below here, the first number, here is a 3, here is a 4, they indicate what that minimal number of crossings is. So that's known as the crossing number. The second number is simply a serial index that tells you this is the first of 2 possible kinds of knots with 5 crossings. They cannot be transformed into one another. They're truly different. And it has been shown that there's no third possibility. So if you have exactly 5 crossings as a minimal number, either you have this knot or you have that knot, or their mirror images. As we go to 6 crossings, we now have 3 possible options, and they're all different, and they're just serial number 1, 2, 3 in an arbitrary order. By the time we go to 7 crossings, we have 7 different possibilities. So that's the first classification of mathematical knots. You simply try to figure out what's the minimal number. And when people first tried to tabulate these knot tables some 100 years ago, there were some tables originally. For a long time it was believed, I think with the 8 crossing knots, that there were 1 more, but then actually 2 were overlooked, and others turned out to be duplicates. So it's really, really challenging. You would think that maybe a computer program can just take a view of an arbitrary knot, an arbitrary diagram, and tell you what knot it is. No, that's unfortunately not true. It's true maybe for the simple knots that have, maybe up to 10 or maybe even 12 crossings. But then it gets really, really hard, because it's so difficult to know how to deform your knot to, first of all, get to the minimum number of crossings, and then how to reshape it in that shape so it looks exactly like something that you already have in your table. People have tried to come up with some mathematical measures to try to describe knots in a formal way.
Like an algorithm or an equation?
Absolutely. And so the crossing number is certainly one of those ways of representing a knot. Another way to represent knots would be that you flatten your knot as much as you can in the plane, and like all of these are sort of 2.5 dimensional diagrams, which are planar diagrams basically with just over-under crossings. So assume you're on the road and you're traveling along one of those paths, and every time you come to crossing, you start numbering them, and you number whether it's over and under. So on the first crossing, you go under and you call it number 1. Next crossing, you may still go under, number 2. Then you go over, number 3. Sometimes you come back to some crossing you have already been. Maybe you had an underpass, now you're on the overpass. Okay, so list that again. But you remember that underpass 3 is the same as overpass 14. And then overpass 4 is the same as underpass 22. And that's another way of describing how that knot is really linked. People like John Horton Conway, he tries to chop up these knot diagrams into smaller pieces that have exactly 4 strands coming out of it, and then they have a little bit of knottiness inside, and group them together and link them together and gradually build a complex knot out of that. And that led to another very formal description that can describe any knot you'd like to describe. There's a Mr. Jones has come up with some kind of a complicated polynomial that describes knots. There's a Mr. Alexander that has created an Alexander polynomial. So you think that, with all this, we really know what's going on. Unfortunately, we still do not know what's going on. If I give you 2 really, really complicated knots and ask you, are they the same? First, you try to struggle, find out, what the crossing number is. Of course, if the crossing number is different, they cannot possibly be the same. Then you struggle with the Jones polynomial, you struggle with the Alexander polynomial. If any one of these polynomials is different, we know the two knots are different. And there are 2 or 3 more characteristics of knots. But even if all the known characteristics of those 2 knots are exactly the same, we can still not be sure that they're indeed the same knot. So there's still an open challenge to find a true descriptor that really will help to make it quite unique when 2 knots are different.
So mathematicians still don't fully know what a knot is. They haven't fully got it.
Well, they know what the knot is, they just don't know if a particular knot exactly which label they should assign to it and whether 2 complicated knots are truly different or not.
Right here.
So this isn't
With
a
some
human.
tape.
This is not human DNA then, or
No, let's assume this is either one of those loops or it's a circular DNA molecule that could be a bacterial genome or it could be just a naturally occurring plasmid.
You are not a knot expert. This is
No,
not
I'm just a knotophile.
You're a knotophile.